Well, good morning, everyone. This is the fourth version of the presentation to the Sixth International Congress on Emotional Intelligence in Oporto, and I'm putting up this presentation to get feedback. In this presentation today, I'm going to discuss why I'm talking about the 7MTF. My argument is emotional intelligence research is too biased towards emotion and moods. We should reverse the direction and research mental disorders and temperament. And then I want to introduce you to the 7MTF, which I think is the best practical tool for lifting your emotional intelligence. It all began, I think, in 1995 when Goldman published Emotional Intelligence. I never got over the fact that it sold 5 million copies in 5 years. And I think Goldman covered two very key questions. Why is emotional intelligence important and what it is? However, and when you talk about emotional intelligence, I think this simple 2x2 quadrants really sort of sums up what defining emotional intelligence. That you've got two elements on the y-axis, self and others, and then two on the x, understanding, influencing. So self-understanding, self-influencing, mindfulness, understanding empathy, and influencing with social skills. It's the key. But there's a big flaw in Goldman's book. Although he describes how you lift your emotional intelligence, what he omits in Appendix A, he doesn't have a model of core emotions. And that leads him to talk about, in emotional intelligence, the 4 levels of emotional intensity. And I think this final paragraph in Appendix A is absolutely critical. Because what he says is that emotions, all of us, all the time, have emotions. And most of the people, some of the time, have moods. But he doesn't talk much about temperament, which I'd say 30% of the people most of the time are dominated by their core, the elements of their temperament. Then finally, you end up, if you have an excessive, for example, depressive tendencies in your temperament, you can end up with having a depressive mental disorder, which is 1% of the people all the time. How the 7MTF got going was, in fact, started in 1920 with a gentleman called Rosenoff. And he was answering the question that many psychologists have tried to answer: what makes us tick? And he effectively said, what drives our core emotions? And what Rosenoff said is that, in fact, it was a heck of an insight at the time, is that we're all slightly mad. Well, he didn't mean that we are mad. I mean, what he meant is that you're not sane or insane. You're positioned along a spectrum. Of course, this is all very much the modern view. And then the other insight that Rosenoff had was, instead of all the physical things that go wrong with you, he said there are actually only 4 mental illnesses, which he listed as cyclothea, schizophrenia, hysteria, and epilepsy. And then he said there was a 5th component called the normal, which holds the other 4 in check. And that's how the 7MTF, or 7 motivational factors, started. What then happened was, in 1935, Humm-Wadsworth came along. Humm was a statistician, Wadsworth was a psychologist, and they're using a technique called factor analysis to develop the first decent psychometric test. And in fact, that was 35. By 1942, over 2 million people, in fact, taken the test. And what they said was the fact that Rosenoff was on the right track, but there weren't 5 main factors, there were in fact 7. And they were manic, and depressive, part of cyclothea, autistic and paranoid were part of schizophrenia, and then they called hysteria the hysteroid, epilepsy the epiloid, and they kept the same term, the normal. And what happened was, I was introduced to the technology, Humm-Wadsworth technology, in the early 1970s on the sales training course, used it very successfully, and ended up writing a book in 1993 called Empathy Selling. But the agent and the publisher both said to me, we can't use terms like autistic and paranoid, so could you come up with new terms? And because people were familiar with the methodology, always talked about big M's, low D's, etc., I came out with a set of 7 terms with the same initial letter. So manic got converted to mover, depressive to double checker, and so on. What then happened was, I retired. I worked in venture capital up to about 2007, retired, and I decided I'd resurrect my interest in emotional intelligence, and started doing much more reading, and came to the conclusion that Humm-Wadsworth, in fact, had, well, they were okay on 4 of the mental illnesses. 3 they'd got wrong. Hysteroid, in fact, was driven by the psychopath or dark triad personality disorder. Epileptoids were on the obsessive compulsive, and the people, the normal spectrum, in fact, was neuroticism. So, with that new terms, I then set up a partnership with a gentleman called Bruce Lewalt in America, and he said, we can't use some of these terms, they're confusing to Americans. And so we came out with a new set of terms for the 7 motivational temperament factors. We changed mover to socializer, as you can see, kept the next 3, changed hustler to a go-getter, and changed formal to a regulator. So that's how we came up with the names. And the way I look at it is in the same way Humm-Wadsworth built on the work of Rosenoff, 7MGF builds on the work of Humm-Wadsworth. Just to introduce you to one of the great things about the 7MGF is that with a simple mnemonic called Top Dog, i.e. the way someone talks, the organization they work for, the position, their dress, what their office looks like, and the gambit, where they keep you waiting for meetings and how soon they use your first name, give you clues to the dominant core components. And it takes about a day to learn the technology. Quite fascinating. And then once they've learned it, they put what I call 7MGF glasses on their head, they're away. And they can use it in various ways. One, understanding themselves. Secondly, having empathy with others. And then using social skills to effectively gain their cooperation. So just to introduce you, there's the 7 components very quickly. The socializer, formerly the mover, are extroverts, very enthusiastic, multitaskers, and their thing in life is they answer what the team think. And of course, if you're at the bottom end of the spectrum, so your socializer low, you're introverted, self-sufficient, and independent. And in terms of socializers, their talk, very friendly, highly energetic, generally late for meetings, but generally on time. And I've got Dev Patel up here because Dame Judi Dench, someone we should always respect, described him as the most energetic actor I've ever met in 56 years. And that's very much the case with socializers, incredibly energetic. So the next people, we talk about double checkers, they're driven by the desire for security. They're very agreeable people, and compassionate and sympathetic, but tend to be pessimistic and critical. Their big question is, what are the risks? And if your D is low, double check low, you have high resilience, but you do tend to be impulsive in your decision making because you don't tend to look at the risks. Double checkers, the way they talk is they're hypochondriacs, generally work in public service or administration. They love earth colors. I always think this picture of Woody Allen is terrific. Here he is surrounded by 3 of the most attractive women in the world, and he's looking miserable. Right. Artists, they're driven by the desire to create. They're open to experience. They tend to be inarticulate, beat to a different drum. And their big question is, what can I change? And if your artist is low, you're down to earth, reliable, and outspoken. I always think this picture, Penelope Cruz is a person I often use. As I said, inarticulate talk, basically very tasteful offices, etc. But there was a lovely article about her in the Sydney Morning Herald magazine, Fire and Ice, Public Passion and Private Reserve, The Complex Life of Penelope Cruz. And some of the things that came out, leapt out in this article was, she arrives alone without an entourage. This, of course, is not the normal way actors are. Her English is surprisingly hesitant. Photography, they're visual, not verbal, is a private fashion. And Penelope is very reserved. This is by the director, of course, Almodovar, who's got the best work out of her. Then we have politicians. They're driven by the desire to win. They're very competitive and assertive. Their question is, who makes the decision? And they generally want them to be. If your politician is low, you're likable, relaxed, balanced personality. Maggie Thatcher was a terrific example of a politician in action. In terms of talk, they suffer from eye strain. I did this, I did that. Light working for big organizations. They're power dressers. Blue is their favorite color. Right. Then we go on to engineers. They're driven by the desire to complete projects. They're conscientious, painstaking planners, practical, objective, hands-on operators. And their first question is, where's the manual? And if your engineer is low, you tend to jump in, you're erratic, and you're slipshod. The 4 gentlemen who comprise people in the Big Bang Theory, they're all basically engineers. But Sheldon, for example, has got a lot of politician as well, Leonard a lot of double checker, with Pally, artist, and Howard's going to cover one of the last components is the go-getter. And as I said, they're consultants, whiteboards in the office, and in fact, in the case of the Big Bang Theory, they even got a whiteboard at home, right? Finally, the next two, we have the go-getters. These are the hustlers. Success, they're driven by one. They listen to one radio station. What's in it for me? That's their big question. They tend to be very empathetic and charming, good financial acumen, but they're acumen and narcissistic. And if your go-getter is low, you tend to be naive, gullible, and a bit of a martyr. Then finally, talking about go-getters, okay, they talk money all the time. They're name droppers. Dress tends to be flashy. Trump up here is a wonderful go-getter in action. He's always wearing a red tie, and of course, the Trump Towers and the Trump buildings are notorious for their glitz. And finally, we have the regulator. As normal, this is driven by the desire for order. These people are low in neuroticism, very emotionally stable. In fact, they're often regarded as cold fish. Their first question is, who else is doing it? And of course, if your regulator is low, you're over-emotional, unconventional, and in fact, you live by the gospel of seizing the day. They talk. I've got George Bush Sr. He was a classic regulator in action, organizing the first coalition, basically, to take after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Very rational, professional. Of course, he was a classic public servant, always dressed conservatively, and was always basically very punctual, very friendly in his conversations. The reason why the big things about what I like about the 7MTF, in fact, it relates heavily to the Big Five. You take the first, using Ocean, the 5 components of the Big Five, which I've got listed there. Of course, the criticisms of the Big Five are 2. Where is the dark triad? Where is the corporate psychopath? Where is the type A personality, the corporate bully? And what I say is, in fact, that the great thing about the 7MTF, 5 most common factors are the Big Five. So the openness, creativity is the artist, conscientiousness is the engineer, extroversion is the socializer, agreeableness is the double checker, and neuroticism is the regulator. And a corporate psychopath is a go-getter with low regulator, and a corporate bully is a politician with low regulator. Practical application, I'll just give you one out of 4, throw it out. I worked in 25 years as a venture capitalist. My standard sort of tagline was 5,000 business plans, 50 deals, 25 write-offs. And in 1996, I and a couple of colleagues started a venture capital management company called Nanyang Ventures. We raised 3 funds, and we were unusual in the fact that we psychologically profiled our entrepreneurs. And at the beginning, we were looking for natural leaders. These are people with high socializer, high go-getter, high politician. And we discovered after about 5 years, we were looking for the wrong people. In fact, what we discovered that the best startup profile was a go-getter, high engineer, and a high numerical IQ. And I actually say that was something like Bill Gates. So, in conclusion, I'd like to thank 3 people for their comments and help in getting this presentation and paper together. This is Brian Leewald, George B. Jack, and Walter Brockburn. I still think EQ research is too biased towards emotions and moods. We should reverse the direction and research mental disorders and temperament. And I firmly believe that the most practical and useful temperament model for people to use to understand the drives in others and to develop social skills is the 7MTF. Thank you for your time.